At the dawn of the 19th century, the United States stood as a fragile experiment, a young republic forged through revolution, yet still untested in the vast theater of global power. Its borders stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River, but beyond that lay an immense swath of land known as the Louisiana Territory, a vast, unexplored wilderness claimed by foreign powers and home to countless Native American nations. This land would become the center of a transaction that would redefine the continent and propel America into a new era. Across the Atlantic, the story was equally volatile in the wake of the French Revolution. Napoleon Bonaparte had seized power in France and begun reshaping Europe with fire and steel. His ambitions stretched beyond Europe to the Americas, where France once claimed a significant colonial presence before the Treaty of Paris in 1763 forced it to relinquish most of its North American holdings to Britain and Spain now. Through a secret treaty with Spain called the Treaty of San Ildefonso, signed in 1800, Napoleon had reclaimed the Louisiana Territory. Though it remained under nominal Spanish control, the reality was that France now owned a region spanning more than 800,000 square miles from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, and from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian border. Napoleon envisioned this land as the keystone of a revitalized French empire in the Western Hemisphere, one that would supply the Caribbean colonies, especially the prized sugar island of Saint-Domingue, with food and resources. But this grand design quickly unraveled in Saint-Domingue. The enslaved population, inspired by revolutionary ideals, rose. In rebellion under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture, the revolution turned the island into a battlefield, costing France thousands of lives and threatening its control over the colony. Yellow fever decimated the French army, and the dream of restoring Saint-Domingue to profitable servitude collapsed without Saint-Domingue. Napoleon lost interest in Louisiana. The territory no longer served its intended purpose, and he began to view it as a liability rather than an asset. Meanwhile, in Washington, President Thomas Jefferson watched these developments with growing concern. The Mississippi River was the lifeblood of American commerce, particularly for farmers in the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys, and the port of New Orleans was the artery through which their goods flowed to international markets. Jefferson, a staunch believer in agrarian democracy, knew that control of this port was essential to the future of the Republic, when Spanish authorities briefly restricted American access to New Orleans. Tensions rose. Jefferson feared that French possession of the port would lead to conflict and perhaps war. Determined to secure American interests, he dispatched James Monroe and Robert Livingston to Paris with instructions to purchase New Orleans and nearby lands for up to $10 million. What they encountered in France was nothing short of astonishing. Napoleon, burdened by war with Britain, disillusioned with colonial ventures, and desperate for funds, offered not just New Orleans but the entire Louisiana Territory for $15 million. The American envoys, recognizing the magnitude of the offer, agreed with minimal hesitation. The deal was struck on April 30th, 1803, and ratified by the United States Senate. Later that year, it would become known as the Louisiana Purchase, and it doubled the size of the nation for less than 3 cents an acre. News of the purchase sparked a wave of excitement across the country, but also confusion and constitutional debate. Jefferson, who had long advocated for strict interpretation of the Constitution, now found himself in murky legal waters. The Constitution made no explicit provision for acquiring new territory by purchase, and Jefferson initially considered proposing a constitutional amendment to authorize the acquisition, but the urgency of the opportunity pushed him to act pragmatically rather than ideologically. He justified the move as a treaty power and moved forward. With confidence, this act of flexibility revealed a president willing to bend principle for the good of the nation, and it set a precedent for future territorial expansion. The implications of the purchase were staggering. 15 future states would eventually emerge from the Louisiana Territory, including Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Oklahoma. It secured American access to the Mississippi River and opened a continental highway for Western migration. The young Republic had suddenly become a continental power with new responsibilities and new challenges. Among these challenges was the fate of Native American tribes who inhabited the region. Their sovereignty ignored their lands absorbed into a nation that had never consulted them. The purchase signaled the beginning of large-scale displacement and conflict as settlers pushed westward and the government laid claim to lands long occupied by indigenous peoples. Another challenge lay in exploration. The territory was largely uncharted, and Jefferson commissioned the now legendary expedition of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to map the region, document its resources, and establish diplomatic relations with native tribes. Their journey would span thousands of miles and bring back tales of vast prairies, towering mountains, strange animals, and diverse cultures. The Louisiana Purchase also altered global geopolitics by removing France from North America. It diminished European influence on the continent and strengthened American autonomy. Napoleon used the proceeds to fund his military campaigns in Europe, while the British watched warily as the United States expanded its territory and influence, though Britain and the United States would soon face each other again. In the War of 1812, the purchase had already shifted the balance of power in North America, profoundly and permanently. The Louisiana Purchase was more than a land deal. It was a statement of purpose, a declaration that the United States would not remain confined to the eastern seaboard. It laid the foundation for manifest destiny, the belief that America was destined to expand across the continent. It challenged the nation's political philosophy, demanded practical governance over abstract ideals, and forced Americans to grapple with the meanings of power, territory, and national identity. This single transaction marked the beginning of a new chapter in American history, one that would shape the future of the hemisphere and signal the emergence of a new world order. In the aftermath of the Louisiana Purchase, the United States found itself in possession of a colossal expanse of land, rich with promise, mystery, and peril. Though the transaction was complete, the reality of governing and understanding this vast region presented a new set of challenges. President Jefferson, aware of the immense unknowns that lay west of the Mississippi River, commissioned an expedition that would become one of the most significant exploratory ventures in American history, led by Meriwether Lewis, Jefferson's private secretary, and William Clark, a seasoned Army officer. The Corps of Discovery was tasked with charting the territory, identifying natural resources, establishing relations with native tribes, and searching for a water route to the Pacific Ocean. This journey would stretch over 2 years, from 1804 to 1806, crossing thousands of miles of rugged terrain and encountering countless obstacles. The expedition was both a scientific mission and a diplomatic one, collecting samples of plants, animals, and minerals while forging fragile alliances with tribes unfamiliar with the newcomers. One of the most crucial members of the expedition was Sacagawea, a Shoshone woman who served as guide, translator, and symbol of peace. Her presence with her infant son helped assure wary tribes of the group's intentions. The data gathered from the journey transformed American understanding of the interior continent, but it also confirmed that the land was already home to diverse and sophisticated indigenous nations whose claims to the territory would be increasingly ignored as settlers moved in with the Louisiana territory now under American sovereignty. New questions arose about governance and law. How would this vast land be divided? Who would control it? How would new states be admitted? The Constitution offered little guidance for integrating such an immense acquisition, so Congress established new administrative structures, beginning with the creation of the Territory of Orleans and the District of Louisiana, which would later become Missouri. The challenge was not just legal but cultural, as American institutions, laws, and settlers began to clash with French, Spanish, and native traditions that had long governed the region. Louisiana, in particular, with its French-speaking Catholic population, presented a unique dilemma for a Protestant, English-speaking American government. Jefferson believed in the power of assimilation, but many residents resisted attempts to reshape their legal codes, languages, and customs. The United States would be forced to adopt a more flexible approach, eventually incorporating elements of French civil law into Louisiana's legal system, a legacy that endures to this day. As settlement increased, the government encouraged land grant surveys and the sale of territory to private citizens and speculators eager to profit from westward expansion. New cities and towns emerged. Trade routes were established, and infrastructure projects began to connect the interior to the eastern markets. Steamboats revolutionized travel and commerce along the Mississippi River, turning New Orleans into a thriving port and cementing the river as a commercial lifeline. Despite the promise of prosperity, tensions quickly arose between Native American tribes and encroaching settlers. Treaties were signed and broken. Displacement became policy, and armed conflict increasingly frequent. The Louisiana Purchase had opened the floodgates to a continental push that would eventually result in the forced relocation of entire tribes, including the infamous Trail of Tears decades later. While Jefferson envisioned a peaceful agrarian republic, his expansionary policies had set in motion a series of conflicts and contradictions that would plague the nation for generations, even within the federal government. The sheer size of the new territory sparked political disputes over power representation and the future of slavery. Southern states eager to expand the institution of slavery saw the western lands as fertile ground for new slaveholding territories, while northern politicians worried about the balance of power and the moral implications of expanding human bondage. These debates intensified with every new territorial organization and statehood application, and the seeds of sectional division were sown long before the Civil War erupted. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was a direct consequence of the Louisiana Purchase and the territorial expansion it enabled, allowing Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state and Maine as a free state, while prohibiting slavery north of the 630 parallel in the remaining territory. This uneasy compromise was a temporary solution to a problem that would eventually tear the nation apart while Americans debated politics and expansion. France was undergoing its own dramatic transformations. After selling Louisiana, Napoleon returned his focus to European dominance, waging war against Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia in a series of bloody campaigns that reshaped the continent. Though he enjoyed early victories, the tide eventually turned, and by 1815 he was defeated and exiled. The collapse of Napoleon's empire marked the end of French ambitions in the Americas and reinforced the United States as the dominant power in North America. The Louisiana Purchase had been both a symptom and a catalyst of these shifting global dynamics. While France retreated, the United States surged forward, laying the groundwork for future acquisitions such as Florida, Texas, Oregon, and ultimately California. The Purchase became the first major step in a doctrine of expansion that would later be called manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was divinely ordained to expand across the continent and bring with it the values of democracy, civilization, and progress. Though often cloaked in noble rhetoric, manifest destiny would justify wars, displacement, and imperialism, and the Louisiana Purchase was its cornerstone in public memory. The Louisiana Purchase came to symbolize vision, foresight, and opportunity. Yet beneath the surface, it revealed a nation struggling to balance its ideals, with its ambitions expanding freedom for some while extinguishing it for others. As the new century unfolded, the land acquired from France would shape the destiny of millions, offering new beginnings for settlers while ending ancient ways of life for indigenous peoples. It was a turning point that demanded not only exploration and governance, but reflection on the very meaning of the American experiment and its place in a rapidly changing world. As the years passed, the Louisiana Territory continued to reshape the fabric of American life, influencing not just political boundaries, but economic development, cultural identity, and international relations. The vast expanse of land offered more than just room to grow. It offered the possibility of wealth, resources, and strategic advantage. As settlers poured into the western frontier, new towns emerged along rivers, trails, and fertile plains, the Mississippi, Missouri, and Arkansas. Rivers became vital arteries of trade, linking remote settlements to eastern markets and foreign ports. Cotton, timber, fur, and grain flowed downstream, while manufactured goods and migrants came upriver, shaping a dynamic cycle of commerce that tied the region into the national economy. The invention of the steamboat accelerated this growth, transforming cities like St. Louis and New Orleans into bustling centers of trade, immigration, and industry. This economic boom was not without consequence, as land speculation surged and banking institutions expanded their influence. Speculative bubbles formed that would periodically burst, leaving devastation in their wake. Yet for many, the land symbolized freedom and opportunity, and the government encouraged this perception by offering land grants and homesteads to veterans and pioneers eager to stake their claims in the American dream. Meanwhile, the diversity of cultures within the Louisiana Territory presented both an opportunity and a challenge as American settlers encountered French, Spanish, German, African, and indigenous traditions. New hybrid communities began to form in places like New Orleans, blending languages, religions, and customs into a unique cultural mosaic that defied easy categorization. Creole identity, Catholic rituals, Cajun cuisine, and jazz music were just a few of the enduring legacies of this cultural fusion that would eventually define much of southern Louisiana and influence American culture at large. However, the expansion also deepened the nation's divisions over slavery and race, as the fertile lands of the Mississippi Valley proved ideal for plantation agriculture. Enslaved labor was rapidly imported to meet the growing demand for cotton, sugar, and rice. This entrenchment of slavery fueled moral outrage in the North and economic entrenchment in the South, intensifying the fault lines that would lead to national conflict debates over whether new territories carved from the Louisiana Purchase would permit slavery-dominated congressional discourse. Every decision seemed to carry the weight of the nation's future balance. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act all traced their roots to the territorial expansions enabled by the Purchase. Even as the nation expanded economically and politically, the human cost of this growth was steep for Native American tribes. The Louisiana Purchase marked the beginning of sustained displacement. Treaties once thought to offer protection or coexistence were routinely broken, as federal and state governments pursued policies of removal and assimilation. Some tribes attempted to adapt, adopting agriculture, forming governments, and engaging in diplomacy, but their efforts were often met with betrayal, violence, or forced migration. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, authorized by President Andrew Jackson, led to one of the darkest chapters in American history, as thousands of native peoples were driven from their ancestral lands in what became known as the Trail of Tears. Though this tragedy affected tribes across the Southeast, it was part of a broader pattern of dispossession that swept across the Western lands. Including those acquired through the Louisiana Purchase, this systemic removal cleared the way for settlers, but at the cost of cultural genocide and immense suffering. As America grew, so too did its sense of destiny and exceptionalism. The belief that it was a chosen nation destined to bring democracy, civilization, and Christianity to the continent and beyond gained traction among politicians, writers, and citizens. Manifest destiny became a rallying cry, and the Louisiana Purchase its original justification. Emboldened by past success, Americans pushed further into Texas, Oregon, California, and beyond each new acquisition, echoing the precedent set by Jefferson and Napoleon. In 1803, yet, with each new conquest came new complications. Managing the growing patchwork of states and territories demanded new infrastructure, political systems, and compromises that strained the nation's unity. The Louisiana Purchase also influenced American foreign policy in profound ways. As the United States established itself as the dominant power in North America, it increasingly flexed its diplomatic and military muscles. The Monroe Doctrine, declared in 1823, warned European powers against further colonization in the Western Hemisphere, a bold assertion made possible in part by the geographic buffer the Louisiana Territory provided. This growing confidence would define American interactions. With the world for generations, the cultural impact of the Louisiana Purchase was equally significant. The westward expansion it enabled inspired generations of writers, artists, and thinkers who saw the frontier as a canvas for American identity. Novels, paintings, and songs glorified the pioneer spirit while also grappling with the moral ambiguities of conquest. Figures like Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett became national icons representing courage, independence, and rugged individualism even. As their real stories were far more complex, this romantic vision of the frontier helped create a mythology that obscured the brutal realities of displacement, slavery, and environmental exploitation. But it also unified a diverse population around. A shared narrative of progress and purpose. Education in the new territories became a priority as communities established schools, libraries, and newspapers to preserve knowledge and foster civic engagement. Churches of various denominations followed. Settlers westward shaping moral and social values along the frontier. In this way, the Louisiana Purchase did not just expand the map, it expanded the imagination of what the United States could be. It offered the promise of reinvention, the idea that a nation born in rebellion could grow not through domination, but through vision, enterprise, and resilience. Yet even as the benefits of the Louisiana Purchase continued to unfold, they carried with them contradictions that the Republic would eventually have to confront. The tension between liberty and oppression, between opportunity and exclusion, between unity and division, was baked into the very soil of the land acquired from France. The vast open spaces offered dreams, but also demanded. Reckoning the Louisiana Territory was a gift and a test, a canvas and a battlefield, a legacy still unfolding. As the 19th century progressed, the vast lands acquired in the Louisiana Purchase continued to shape every facet of American development. From its political landscape to its economic ambitions and cultural evolution, the western frontier remained a beacon for opportunity, hardship, and reinvention, drawing wave after wave of settlers, dreamers, and opportunists who saw in the open plains and river valleys not just land, but the promise of transformation. Railroads emerged as the arteries of this growing nation, stretching across the prairies, connecting distant outposts with bustling cities and creating a unified market where goods, people, and ideas could flow freely. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, was one of the crowning achievements of this period, symbolizing both industrial might and national unity, even as it cut through lands still contested by native peoples and disrupted ancient migratory paths. The land promised freedom, but too often delivered conflict and dispossession. The economic transformation that followed the purchase was staggering. Cities like St. Louis, Kansas City, and New Orleans flourished into major commercial hubs, blending the cultural legacies of their French, Spanish, African, and native roots with the entrepreneurial spirit of a growing republic. Agriculture boomed as the Midwest became the breadbasket of the world, producing wheat, corn, and livestock in quantities previously unimaginable. This growth demanded labor and infrastructure, prompting innovations in machinery, transportation, and finance, as well as political debates over tariffs, land rights, and federal versus state control. Yet at the heart of these advances were deep contradictions, as enslaved people were forced to build the prosperity of others, and indigenous nations continued to be displaced through violent campaigns and unjust treaties. These injustices did not go unchallenged. Abolitionists, reformers, and indigenous leaders raised their voices against the tide of exploitation, demanding a nation that lived up to its founding ideals. The Civil War would eventually erupt in part due to tensions that had been inflamed by territorial expansion and the unresolved question of slavery in the newly acquired land. States formed from the Louisiana Territory became key battlegrounds in the ideological and military struggle for the nation's soul. Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, and others were torn between loyalty to the Union and the Confederacy, their strategic locations and divided populations making them critical theaters in the bloody conflict. When the war finally ended in 1865, the nation faced the enormous task of Reconstruction, not just in the physical sense, but in the moral and constitutional sense. What kind of republic would emerge from the ashes? One that honored liberty, or one that continued to replicate systems of exclusion and hierarchy in the decades that followed the legacy of the Louisiana Purchase became a double-edged sword. On one side, it remained a source of pride. A visionary leap that secured land, wealth, and power. On the other, it symbolized the darker undercurrents of American expansionism, including the broken promises to native peoples and the long shadow of racial injustice. Westward expansion did not slow after the Civil War. In fact, it accelerated as the Homestead Act railroads and post-war industrial growth opened even more of the West to settlers. Millions of immigrants arrived from Europe and Asia seeking freedom and fortune. Many found it, others found only hardship and discrimination, as economic booms gave way to busts, and the land proved less forgiving than promised. The myth of the American West often overlooked the reality that many who ventured west did not find prosperity but poverty. Yet despite these challenges, the cultural identity of the United States continued to be shaped by the frontier experience. Literature, photography, and later film romanticized the era of cowboys, pioneers, and outlaws, cementing the Louisiana Purchase, not just as a historical event, but as a foundational myth of American greatness. Schools taught the story of Jefferson's bargain as evidence of national destiny, omitting or glossing over the displacement of native tribes and the consequences of expansion. By the turn of the 20th century, the United States had transformed from a fragile coastal republic into a continental power with influence stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific and from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes. The Louisiana Purchase had been the catalyst for this transformation, not just by doubling the nation's territory, but by instilling a sense of limitless potential. This mindset carried over into American foreign policy as the nation increasingly looked beyond its borders, asserting itself in Latin America, Asia, and eventually Europe, guided by the same ambition that had fueled its continental conquest. Yet as the 20th century unfolded, voices emerged demanding a more honest reckoning with the past. Native American leaders, historians, and activists challenged the sanitized narratives that dominated. Textbooks and monuments they pointed to: the Trail of Tears, the massacre at Wounded Knee, and countless lesser-known injustices that stemmed from policies of removal and assimilation. They demanded recognition, land rights, cultural preservation, and justice, and their efforts slowly began to reshape the national conversation. Legal victories, cultural revivals, and growing public awareness signaled a shift toward accountability and inclusivity. The Louisiana Purchase thus remained a living legacy, its impact visible not only in maps and monuments, but in the ongoing struggles over identity, power, and justice. As the United States entered the 21st century, the land once considered wild and untamed had become home to cities, farmlands, universities, highways, and diverse communities. Its resources fueled innovation. Its people defined its culture, and its boundaries marked the arena in which American democracy would continue to be tested. Environmental concerns emerged as new frontiers, replacing the old debates about settlement water. Scarcity, deforestation, climate change, and land preservation took center stage as Americans reconsidered their relationship to the land, so hastily acquired 2 centuries earlier. Indigenous stewardship. Traditions once dismissed were being revisited with new respect, offering insights into sustainable living and ecological balance. Educational institutions, museums, and public discourse began to re-examine the Louisiana Purchase through a more nuanced lens, acknowledging both its transformative achievements and its painful costs for those whose lands were taken and whose voices were silenced in the grand narrative. The Purchase had not merely changed the shape of a country, it had altered its very trajectory, enabling the rise of a superpower while demanding generations of reckoning. The Louisiana Purchase was a story of vision and violence, of opportunity and oppression, of hope and heartbreak. It revealed the best and worst of the American Experiment the brilliance of a peaceful acquisition of territory on such a massive scale and the tragedy of how that territory was claimed, settled, and governed. In the end, the Louisiana Purchase stood not just as a chapter in history, but as a mirror reflecting who Americans were, who they claimed to be, and who they aspired to become. Its legacy was neither simple nor static, but dynamic, layered and ongoing as the nation continues to wrestle with the promises and paradoxes it inherited. From that bold decision made in 1803,